Hey baby, looking for a date?
Well, that all depends. How much?
For a hot one like yourself, my price is 40 to shake the earth.
Gosh, look at the time. I just remembered a thing. Ow. Vampire games are a rare breed, or rather, good vampire games are a rare breed. For most gamers with a penchant for the dark and broody bloodsuckers, the game that tends to come to mind as the pinnacle of vampire gaming is Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. And rightly so. Bloodlines is a spectacular game with a fully realised world, numerous methods of progression, hidden details, intrigue, backstabbing and much, much more. Other efforts in the genre have been far less savoury. Dark, released in 2013, was a dodgy effort at best. There are a few Castlevania games wherein you play a thirsty beast. Bethesda's Elder Scrolls series has allowed you to play as a vampire for the past 12 years, though its impact on your game is minimal. The earliest example that I've played is the Legacy of Kain series, another legendary IP sadly lost to the sands of time, and for anyone in search of a throwback, the Blood Rain series was also a favourite of mine back in the day. And not just because it features the eminent Laura Bailey. But the reality is that the vampire is a creature sorely overlooked in gaming. Zombies have been the norm now for a good 10 years, if not longer. Gaming trends come and go in waves, with only the brainless undead persisting with any degree of success. But one trend that has never seemed to settle well is the vampire. As a concept, vampires have endured in novels, cinema and television far better than they have in gaming. Maybe it's because making a good game in which you play a vampire is difficult. I'd go so far as to say that it would be a mammoth undertaking. How do you make a game as rich and complex as Masquerade in a modern engine, where graphics are the selling point and world building is a dirty phrase? Vampire is to Vampire the Masquerade what Deus Ex Human Revolution is to the original Deus Ex. Both are good, fun, well-made games, but the transition from the early 2000s to the visually demanding and performance-based 2010s has caused them to lose something in the interim, a sense of scale. Vampire is the brainchild of Don't Nod Entertainment, a promising company whose previous games, 2015's Life is Strange and 2013's Remember Me, portray a company capable of great ideas, but not necessarily the ability to fully realise them. Remember Me suffered from pacing issues and could be tedious at times, whereas Life is Strange built up an enormous world-ending threat, only to have the ending hinge upon a choice some fans called way back when the first episode was released. With the reins of Before the Storm handed off to Deck 9, Don't Nod were free to nurture their latest IP to the proverbial perfection. A perfection that is, unfortunately, still proverbial. Set in London in the aftermath of World War I, you play returning field surgeon Jonathan Reed, a celebrated doctor-turned-vampire by a mysterious fiend. In a city teeming with Spanish influenza and mutated half-human, half-vampire hybrids known as Scowls, your job is to uncover the source of the vampire threat and put a stop to it, all the while keeping a close eye on the districts to ensure the health and safety of its inhabitants, if you want. Vampire boots up with a brief little disclaimer on its medicinal practices, alongside a rather self-assured statement proclaiming that every choice matters and that you should choose wisely. There are an awful lot of games making this bold claim these days. Every Telltale game does it, Life is Strange did it. It seems like an epidemic at this juncture, though that's kind of beside the point. Vampire hinges upon two central mechanics, conversation and combat. Part mystery and part beat the shit out of things, the typical focus of any run is going to be navigating the city streets in search of a floating quest marker, and speaking to citizens to uncover events in their lives, lies they've told and quests they're offering. In general, most citizens have one quest associated with them. With the city map split into 4 boroughs, the Docks, the West End, Whitechapel and Pembroke Hospital, this comes out at roughly 30 to 40 side quests to involve yourself in. Meddling in other people's affairs is interesting in and of itself, given that at times a seemingly innocent decision can lead to an unfortunate outcome. This doesn't happen often enough to justify the game's opening gambit about its choices, which can lend the game an unfortunate shallow feeling, but it is nonetheless interesting and evocative. More than anything though, conversation serves to give you the opportunity to cleanse someone's blood, as it were. By uncovering facts about various people and discussing it with them, you can boost the amount of XP you receive by embracing them. Embracing being a particularly flowery term for biting the bejesus out of their neck, which sadly doesn't actually turn them into a vampire, just kills them. More on that in a moment. XP is, as you might imagine, needed to upgrade your skills, ranging from health and stamina upgrades to new abilities, ultimate attacks which deal immense amounts of damage, and carrying capacity for bullets and syringes used to provide instant blood or health and stamina. Each physical attack falls under one of three categories: blood, melee, or shadow, with a final category reserved for firearms. All of the enemies have particular weaknesses and strengths which you can observe beforehand by using your vampire senses, this being the vampire equivalent of Batman's detective mode. As is typical with RPGs, your level determines the amount of damage you can deal and punishment you can take. Most of the boroughs are split into particular level caps, with the earliest being your first region, Pembroke Hospital, typically starting at the level 5 to 14 mark depending on the point in the game that you're at. Unlike many other RPGs, however, with the right tactics, patience and forethought, even an extremely low-level character can defeat a man or a monster with a giant red number hovering over their head. Although the game's enemies adapt and evolve as you progress, there are almost always methods of avoiding combat altogether, or if you're feeling especially lazy, you can just dash through them with a quick stab of the sprint button. I appreciate Vampire's combat for what it's trying to be, and whilst it does feel very clunky and inaccurate at times, especially when you're using two-handed weapons, it's not all that difficult to just circle strafe enemies and dodge until an opening appears. Whilst it can be tedious, the game gives you ample opportunities to upgrade yourself and your weapons, and there are a reasonable amount of one-handed and two-handed weapons to try out. As is traditional by this point, hunting around for supplies as much as humanly possible makes it considerably easier to upgrade your weapons, and if you're too lazy to do that but have plenty of money at your disposal, you can always buy upgrade materials from the local vendor. The only real issue I have with Vampire's combat is that it is unreasonably punishing to players who want to tackle the game without embracing any citizens. Since doing this is the easiest and fastest way to net yourself large amounts of XP, choosing not to do so can make the game extremely difficult and time-consuming. Combat becomes a game of fencing, jumping in and out, and hoping your dodge button actually works this time. Vampire has no difficulty selection, and whilst I have no problem with this in general, when you consider that this game makes great efforts to remind you that every action has consequences, and electing to engage in behaviour of the neck-biting variety causes the overall health of a district to decline, which in turn can result in areas turning hostile, the deaths of all the local civilians, and the appearance of extremely dangerous enemies, it seems a little unreasonable or unfair, and not to mention rather rich of them, to expect players to deal with the difficulty whilst refraining from trying to boost their ability to not die every 5 seconds. You do gather XP naturally as you progress, either by talking to people, completing quests, or curing civilians of their various ailments. One of the game's other core mechanics is its curative measures, wherein you create 9 different medicines for a variety of afflictions, ranging from the common cold to neuralgia. You don't have to do it, and choosing not to cure citizens has 2 impacts. The immediate result is that a citizen's blood quality is lowered, which causes the XP gain by embracing them to drop dramatically. The second, long-term result is that the overall health of the district begins to decline, and even if you're not actively going out of your way to murder and maim people, it can still result in a district succumbing to chaos. It's an interesting way of maintaining the balance of Reed's status as a doctor and his affliction as a vampire, but I'm not convinced it works the way it was intended. What tends to happen is that after the end of each major story segment, where you typically make a choice that decides the fate of an entire district, a sporadic outbreak of sickness will take over, and this means you then have to spend a silly amount of time running from borough to borough healing every single citizen you can find. There is, thankfully, a way to keep track of everyone in the menu, and the game does tell you what they're suffering from so you can plan accordingly. But since the game has no fast travel mechanic, largely because it isn't really big enough to warrant one, if you're committed to the upkeep of a district, then you're going to be spending an awful lot of time running around after people who've got the damn sniffles. Thankfully, this is all slightly mitigated by the fact that a district status will only worsen during the daytime while Reed is sleeping, and since Reed will only go to bed if you tell him to, it is entirely possible to spend a whole hour of real-world time running from district to district without having to worry that something awful is going to happen somewhere else in the meantime. Now this, I have to say, is a real shame. When the game first loads, Reed wakes up at pretty much the crack of dawn, and as you escape from the forces of Priwen, a bunch of gun-toting monster hunters with a particularly uncanny ability to shoot you from 1,000 miles away, the sun begins to rise and you are forced to find shelter. But this never happens again. The game has no actual day-night cycle. In-game time only progresses when you're done faffing about and want to rest so that you can use your XP and upgrade your abilities. This, in turn, means that if you're anything like me, you'll essentially drive the entirety of Act 1's plot forward all in the space of one night. It's not necessarily a bad thing per se, but it strikes me as a little strange that an effort was made to set up the potential to be caught out by the rising sun, but then the actual ability to do so was stripped away as soon as the game proper began. Speaking of plot, the game's story is a strange mixture of interesting and all over the place. It jumps from point to point without a huge degree of cohesion, and the threadbare strings that tangle it together fall apart by around the midpoint. Things just seem to happen without any real rhyme or reason, yet the game is convinced that plenty of warning and build-up has occurred. A particularly bizarre example happens at around the midpoint of the game, where you are asked to follow up on a few murders. When you find the culprit of these murders, Reed makes an odd comment about having a string of bodies in their wake, with the implication that this is something that's been going on for quite some time. But from the point at which the first body appears to the point where you confront the culprit, there are literally 2 bodies. Not to mention the fact that if you so desire, you can deal with this entire plotline all in one night. There's a strange disconnect between the method of storytelling and the way it actually unfolds depending on the player's actions, and I'm not sure this is something that could ever have been avoided. Reed has his own character and his own motivations. He wants to cure the vampire epidemic as well as the Spanish flu, all whilst trying to uncover who made him what he is. And his character is reasonably well written and interesting to unravel, but he has been thrust into a plot that is not so much by the numbers as it is an alphabet soup. There are several beats that the story hits, but none of them seem to actually factor into one another, with the exception of the revelation of the cause of the outbreak. It's almost like a novel, being written by the world's most unreliable narrator, proclaiming loudly that this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. It's extremely bizarre, and it's very difficult to take the game seriously when it doesn't actually seem to know what it's trying to do half the time. Still, after everything I've just said, I have to concede that there is something uniquely compelling about Vampire. Despite all of my frustrations, the wonky combat, the dodgy story, and the unreasonable difficulty curves, I still actively wanted to carry on. I wanted to know what would happen next. I enjoyed the onus of having to keep everything in perfect shape to guarantee the best outcome, and how easy it was even then to make fatal mistakes. What I liked more than anything was the fact that not every choice laid out before you led to a satisfying conclusion, which meant that my first run of the game resulted in some abysmal mistakes being made, the consequences of which weren't always immediate. If you're hankering for something different to play this summer, I would tentatively recommend Vampire. It's not an especially remarkable game and doesn't necessarily do anything I would consider exceptional or exciting, but it is good fun when it's not being tedious. The characters and the way you interact with the world are diverse and intriguing, and Reed is both a complex and sympathetic character, even if he does have an irritating habit of repeating the same 3 lines of dialogue when you munch on a rat. This isn't everything I want in a vampire game. Perhaps it's a good sign of something better on the horizon. The Vampire deserves to be given not a competent game, but a great one. It's been far too long, and I don't know about you, but I'm definitely down to parade the masquerade again.